Today, we'll talk about political organization. We've come all the way from the level of the individual up through the family to kinship and to even larger social categories like ethnic groups. Political organization is the largest, most inclusive form of social organization and is based largely on territorial residence. Now, politics is a tricky concept. In our own society, it tends to mean formal governmental institutions and the campaigns one goes through to get to those institutions. But in the majority of societies around the world, and the overwhelming majority throughout human history, there have been no formal governments nor any campaigns and elections. So what does politics mean for those societies? Quoting the anthropologist Morton Fried, your textbook defines politics as relating to the management of public policy, but as Kotak points out, that assumes that there is such a thing as a formal public policy. More generally, politics can be taken to mean the process of making decisions that affect the entire community, or to put it slightly differently, the social institution devoted to making those decisions. Now, how those decisions are made, of course, varies. Does the entire community come together and debate the matter? Does one designated ruler make decisions on his own, which others are bound to obey? Or is there a governing council made up of only certain members of the community? What sorts of issues can that leader or that council make decisions about? All those issues are basically political in nature. Coupled with the concept of politics is the idea of the polity. A polity is an autonomous political unit. That is, it's the largest social unit for which political decisions are made. A polity is not a smaller part of a larger political unit, say like the state of Indiana is part of the United States. It may, however, be comprised of smaller units, again, like the states are part of the U.S. polity. Polities can range in size from an extended family all the way up to modern China with about 1.4 billion people. It's true that today, all cultural groups around the world are embedded in a nation state, and so many are not technically polities. However, in many cases, the integration between local political decision-making and the nation-state level of politics is very loose. Yanomami villages in Venezuela very seldom send delegates to the Venezuelan government, for example, and mostly they take care of themselves. In such cases, it can be more useful to fudge the definition a little bit and think of Yanomami villages as truly autonomous and therefore polities. The variation in how polities are organized will take up the bulk of this lecture, but they all provide two essential social functions to their populations. They integrate and they regulate. Integrate means that polities and the less inclusive social organizations they include tie together people in social relationships that enable and encourage the individuals to live together. Integration creates society with a capital S, that web of relationships we talked about at the beginning of the course. Regulation, on the other hand, perpetuates society. Regulation is the means by which individuals' behaviors are maintained within acceptable ranges, making people's behaviors predictable and reasonable. Different types of political organization achieve these two goals in different manners. Studying politics per se is difficult because decision-making procedures are so infinitely variable, and because the very sorts of decisions that must be made vary so much from one culture to another. To simplify the matter, some anthropologists have taken an historical particularist approach. They study one particular politics, and nothing else. Others are more interested in a comparative approach, and they have taken a typological approach. A typology is a system for sorting things into categories based on shared traits. So a political typology sorts polities into categories based on how they practice politics. Two typologies are relevant here, and your textbook only really acknowledges one. The second is there, though. It's just hidden because the two systems are so similar to one another. The system your book uses was proposed by Elman R and was first published in 1962 in a book called Primitive Social Organization. It involves four basic types of political organization: band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. Each of them differs from the others in its socio-political complexity. Sociopolitical complexity refers to exactly what it seems to refer to. How complex is the society's political organization? It can be measured by the number of social groups making up the society and the number of relationships among those groups. As the number of people in a community increases, the number of relationships among them increases much more quickly. The kinds of political processes that can integrate and regulate small groups won't work with larger groups. So larger communities need to create new kinds of politics to cope. Service looked for patterns in how decision-making changed with polity size and divided polities into four categories. Bands have very few subsidiary groups with relatively simple relationships. States have very many groups with very complicated relationships. Parallel and overlapping with this system is the one proposed by Morton Fried. Fried's typology includes three categories: egalitarian, ranked, and stratified. These organizational types differ from one another in how they show differential access to three important social resources: wealth, prestige, and power. Wealth is a measure of the accumulation of valued goods. Power is the ability to make people do things whether they want to or not. Prestige is a culturally based judgment of an individual's value or worth. In Fried's terminology, in an egalitarian society, no social group has special, privileged access to any of these resources. In a stratified society, at least one group has privileged access to all three, and rank societies fall in between the other two. Culture is integrated, remember. So both political typologies also correlate with other social institutions like subsistence and economy. As we look at the four types of political organization described by Service, we'll see that they overlap the three categories described by Fried. For example, according to Service, the simplest form of political organization is the band. Bands are, on the basis of archaeological evidence, the oldest form of human society. All band societies are hunter-gatherers, but not all hunter-gatherers are bands. Bands are small, usually a single extended family tied to other extended families through intermarriage. The polity is the band itself. The most important aspect of band organization is that, in Fried's terminology, they're egalitarian. In an egalitarian society, no social group has privileged access to wealth, power, or prestige. There's still unequal access to these resources on the individual level, however. Due to differences in strength, personality, or luck, individuals can gain extra access to wealth by being a better hunter, say, to power by being physically stronger, or to prestige by being unusually charismatic or smart. What's important is not that individual differences exist, but that no group differences exist. A man may achieve prestige and popularity because of his great hunting prowess, but he cannot transfer that prestige to his family or his lineage. And his prestige as a hunter does not stop other great hunters from gaining their own prestige. This is the heart of the definition of egalitarianism given by Fried himself. In an egalitarian society, there are as many statuses as there are people in society. Anyone capable of filling a role, the behaviors that go along with a status, can do so. There can be as many leaders or fathers or ritual leaders as there are people with the skills and desire to fill those roles. Egalitarianism does not mean that everyone is necessarily equal, but it does mean that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate. In other words, only gender and age status are ascribed. Everything else is achieved. Because the subsistence strategy of bands is relatively simple, hunting and gathering, and the population is so small, with only a handful of people, there is relatively little demand for social regulation. Kinship relationships and tradition keep most people in line, and kinship and marriage integrates the band into a cohesive social unit. The next most complex political form is the tribe. Tribes can either be hunter-gatherers or farmers, sedentary or nomadic, but they tend to be horticulturalists or pastoralists more often than not. Their populations are rather larger than bands, maybe a few hundred to 1,000 or 2,000. Because there are more people in a tribe, it's more difficult to integrate and regulate them. Whereas kinship tends to be sufficient for bands, tribes must add other, somewhat more formal measures. It's important to note here that the word tribe in this context should not be mistaken as a synonym for ethnic group. In a less strict usage, certain kinds of ethnic groups, usually egalitarian, are called tribes. But in political anthropology, tribe refers to a polity, an autonomous, self-governing political unit. This is usually restricted to the single village or, in some circumstances, a few nearby villages. Thus, an ethnic group may generally have a tribal organization, but there are in fact many tribes that make up the ethnic group. This is how we can say that the population of a tribe is limited to a few hundred people, but that the tribal Yanomami, for example, have a population of about 26,000. The politics of tribes are rather variable, but they remain egalitarian. No recognized social group has any advantage in wealth, power, or prestige, and anyone who is capable of participating in politics has an opportunity to do so. In many cases, tribe is a catch-all term for egalitarian societies that aren't bands. Generally, political decisions are still based on consensus, but the methods for arriving at those agreements are more formalized, perhaps in the form of a community-wide council or a nominally powerful village headman. When the tribal polity encompasses several villages, there may be more than one council, or inter-village decision-making may be more informal. Some tribal polities have a somewhat more formal political structure, especially those found in New Guinea and Melanesia. These tribes are regulated by big men. Big men are men, and occasionally women, who've attained a position of prominence through trading with others, and manipulated that position into one of political importance. They have personally accumulated wealth and prestige and parlayed that into power. A big man can make decisions for others without their having much of a say in the matter. Cultural ideas like debt or gratitude obligate a follower to do what his big man asks, but if a follower decides to refuse, there's not much a big man can do about it. While big men are clearly community leaders who exercise political power in a variety of contexts, this does not constitute a real political hierarchy. The society is still egalitarian, because anyone can become a big man, provided he or she is capable of gathering support and making the proper sorts of gifts. Also, while the sons of past big men do have a bit of an advantage, having been raised by an expert dealmaker, their ascension to big man status on their own is by no means guaranteed. A big man cannot pass on his leadership position to his family. Since no social group has privileged access to power, only individuals do, this is an egalitarian structure. Tribes are also integrated and regulated through non-kin groups. Since the population of a tribe is larger, not everyone is close kin with everyone else, and kinship no longer serves to tie people together. Instead, people join different kinds of organizations that connect non-kin. These can be sodalities, which are social groups with defined memberships whose members participate voluntarily and who are not necessarily related to one another. Examples of sodalities include religious societies or war parties, or fraternal organizations like the Elks or Freemasons. Even things like amateur sports leagues are sodalities. Non-kin associations can also be based on age or gender. An age set is an organization that is made up of everyone of a certain age range. For example, among the Maasai of East Africa, all the men are divided into groups like young men, warriors, that is adults, and elders based on their age. Each age set then performs certain public functions to benefit the community. The warriors, for example, act as police in the local villages, while the elders serve on village councils. A gender organization, on the other hand, is made up of everyone of the appropriate gender regardless of age. Your textbook talks about the Poro in West Africa, a men's organization that exercises great political authority in some tribal societies. Moving on, the next most complex polity is the chiefdom. A chiefdom generally has anywhere from 1,000 to several tens of thousands of people. To feed that many people in a contiguous territory, chiefdoms almost have to be agriculturalists. There are examples of hunter-gatherer chiefdoms, though, most notably in the Pacific Northwest and in California. These paintings, by the way, illustrate the Cahokia chiefdom, the largest polity to emerge in prehistoric North America, just outside of modern St. Louis. About 800 years ago, Cahokia had as many as 20,000 inhabitants who were fed through intensive cultivation of maize, beans, and squash in the Mississippi River Valley. The biggest difference between chiefdoms and the simpler forms of society is that chiefdoms are no longer egalitarian. Chiefdoms are rank societies. In an egalitarian society, no social group has differential access to wealth, prestige, or power. In a rank society, certain descent groups have privileged access to prestige. That is, by virtue of whom your parents are, you get either high prestige or low prestige. But those same groups usually have only limited privileges when it comes to wealth or power. While everyone in the community lives roughly the same lifestyle, eating the same foods, using the same technology, and so on, the higher-ranking individuals are simply thought to be a better kind of person. Ranking ascribes prestige, as well as some important social statuses, to individuals based on their kinship. Leadership is ascribed according to genealogy. Because of this, important social positions, most notably that of chief, are inherited. The classic example of a ranking system, called a Ramage, is found in several Polynesian islands, such as Hawaii and Tahiti. Polynesian societies were traditionally patrilineal, so only men are represented on this chart. You can see how the most prestigious person, person A, enjoys only a little more prestige than his first cousin, person B, because they're both sons of brothers in the generation before. The only difference is that person A's father was the older brother and person B's father was the younger brother. Person A is a direct, eldest descendant of the founding ancestor, while people with very low prestige, like W and X, are descended from the same ancestor through many youngest son ties. Since he is the most valued, worthy, and respected individual, Person A serves as chief and wields the legitimate authority to make political decisions that affect the entire chiefdom. Chiefs are needed in chiefdoms because now that there are multiple thousands of people in society, sodalities, marriage, and kinship are no longer up to the tasks of integrating everyone together into a single society. Chiefs are full-time political specialists, people whose only job is to run the local government and make sure that people can continue to live together in a single society. Because he, or in some cases she, is occupied with politics and government, the chief usually is not involved in producing food and goods for himself and his family. Tribal big men are still managing their own farms and building their own houses, but chiefs and their assistants are supported by their communities, freeing up their attention for more important matters. Chiefs regulate the chiefdom by controlling the economy and by enforcing social norms. On the economic side, chiefdoms tend to adopt a redistributive economy. Individual households farm or produce economic goods, which they then pay to the chief in the form of taxes. The chief gathers the various products from throughout his chiefdom, then redistributes them to producers according to need. A particular household may not get back what it paid, either in kind or in amount, but resource differences are leveled out throughout the chiefdom and everyone is provided for. Of course, since the chief and his assistants are not themselves farmers, they're full-time political specialists, they also support themselves from the taxes paid to them. Sometimes much more goes up the social hierarchy than ever comes back down to the original farmers. In this way, the prestige of the chief and his entourage can be turned into wealth. Chiefdoms typically do not have laws in the sense of written regulations, but they do frequently have chiefly courts, where traditional rules of social behavior are enforced. Chiefs have authority to enforce rules by punishing those who break them, but their actual power may be rather limited. For example, among some African chiefdoms, the chief cannot intervene in murder cases that do not involve his own clan as either the culprit or the victim. In those cases, it's the responsibility of the victim's clan to seek justice on its own. But in other cases, such as adultery, the chiefly court can and does hand down sentences. The extent of real power exercised by chiefs varies widely in different chiefdoms. The most complex polity that Service described was the state. States are usually characterized by the appearance of cities in writing, though not always. The earliest Chinese kingdoms had no true cities, for example, and the Inca Empire, the largest and most populous state in the world at the time, had no writing system. On the other hand, states are always agricultural or industrial because the number of people in a state has usually increased over that of a chiefdom. Because they're so large, integrating and regulating so many people is a difficult task. This time, in addition to the chief and his few assistants, you get the development of a professional bureaucracy. These are officials whose job it is to oversee just a portion of the government. Priests, generals, ministers of state, and so on. A king or other supreme government coordinates the bureaucracy rather than managing matters directly. In Fried's typological system, states are known as stratified societies. In a stratified society, there are large groups that have markedly differential access to all three sources of social inequality: wealth, power, and prestige. These groups are called classes. Stratified societies are hierarchically organized, just like rank societies are, but they're organized hierarchically according to different criteria. Among rank societies, the hierarchy is based on descent. Here, the social hierarchy is economic. Classes are different groups of people whose members have markedly different levels of access to wealth. From access to wealth, groups are able to acquire more access to power or prestige. They can use their wealth to control economic resources, forcing others to do what they want. That's power. And because they have that power, others look up to them and want to be like them. That's prestige. Consequently, in a stratified society, upper classes have almost exclusive access to power and prestige. Lower classes are almost excluded from power and prestige altogether. Classes in society create large gaps in prestige and wealth. Unlike a rank system, where prestige increases gradually from least prestigious to most prestigious, in a class system there are large breaks. The most prestigious lower class individual may still be much less prestigious than the least prestigious upper class individual. So instead of a pyramid, society is structured like a stairway. All members of the same class share roughly the same prestige and wealth, but they're very different from other classes. This layer caking helps to integrate such a large population. Since the population is now so large, most people are no longer related to one another. Sodalities and non-voluntary associations are no longer adequate to overcome the problems, again because there are so many people involved. Class membership integrates large numbers of people into a handful of groups based on economic factors, effectively splitting the state society into chunks. For example, everyone in the upper class belongs to the country club, eats at the same fine restaurants, attends the same ritzy church. And because of endogamy, they tend to marry one another as well. So kinship, sodalities, etc. integrate all the upper class people into one group. Meanwhile, the lower class belongs to the Elks Club, they eat at McDonald's, they go to the little church in the corner, they also intermarry within their class. So they're also integrated as a class. Then government and the economy holds the upper and lower classes together. The upper class owns the factories and the lower class works on the factory floor. They're both subject to the same local courts. In this way, there's no upper limit on the population size of states. As the population grows larger, you simply add more classes, that is, more steps on the stairway. In the Middle Ages, European cultures had only two classes, a nobility and a peasantry. Then we added a middle class. In recent decades, we talk about an upper middle class and a lower middle class. And even more recently, we've begun talking about the rich and the 1%, further dividing that upper class. I'll stop here for the discussion of political organization, but before I do, I want to mention that your book has several pages of very good discussion on social control and informal methods of conflict resolution. You should read those pages closely and understand the different strategies involved and the different options for resolving disputes. As always, you'll be responsible for both the book and the lecture for the exam. Finally, be sure to make good use of the discussion forum for these lectures. If something isn't clear, ask. Operating online is naturally much more difficult than doing so in person, so make full use of the tools that we have available to make up that deficit.